ਸਿਮਰ ਮਨਾ ਸਿਮਰ ਮਨਾ RAM ਨਾਮ ਚਿਤਾਰ.
Hello, welcome to Introduction to the Sikhs, Lecture 14. And we'll continue our discussion of Sikh society. We'll look at some of the religious diversity within the community and also religious institutions. So religious authority in the Sikh community goes back to its origins again. Historically, the Guru was the final authority. And definitely from the time, more formally from the time of Guru Har Gobind, the sixth Guru, but even earlier, the Guru represented an integration of spiritual and temporal authority. In this context, Guru Gobind Singh created the Khalsa partly to do away with intermediaries that had been introduced by the third Guru, Guru Amar Das, to help manage connections to a large and diverse community, spread out community. But this was a way of, again, bringing the community closer to the Guru as the final authority. Now, with the end of the institution of having a human Guru, the Guru Granth Sahib became the final authority in many ways. But also the Khalsa and the Guru Panth served as the word representing the authority or the word of the Guru. One practical example of that would be that a General Assembly of Sikhs could pass a resolution called a Gurmata, which would then be taken to be binding on the Sikh community. Maybe a slight observation here, also touching on the topic we ended our last lecture with, the issue of gender. When Guru Gobind Singh passed away, for some time actually his widow served as Mata Sundari served as the leader, de facto leader of the Sikh Panth in some ways, and was viewed as representing a source of authority, though she didn't take the title of Guru, of course. So in general, within this historical background, what one sees is actually a great deal of decentralization of authority and a great deal of heterogeneity in the community and in terms of how authority is exercised. Just sticking with the main institutions of religious authority, the Shiromani Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee, or known mostly by its initials SGPC, was created in 1925. And this was actually a legal creation. This was the culmination of a protest movement by Sikhs to rescue the Gurdwaras from the hands of corrupt functionaries. And these were Gurdwaras that had historical significance, the birthplace of Guru Nanak, and so on. And the SGPC was created as a management authority. It has become extremely important because it controls the donation revenue to the Gurdwaras, so it has a lot of authority through the power of its purse. Within from the more religious perspective, each of 5 Gurdwaras, the 5 takhts or thrones that are particularly historically significant, are viewed as having special authority. There's the Akal Takht in Amritsar, which is associated with the Darbar Sahib. And then there are 4 other takhts associated with, particularly with the life of Guru Gobind Singh. And the Jathedars, or the leaders of these takhts, are viewed as having special authority. But again, they're how in practice how much they're able to determine what Sikhs actually do can be limited by, again, the heterogeneity of the community and diversity of opinions. Another aspect of Sikh institutions is the code of conduct. This is known in Punjabi as the Reht Maryada, meaning code of conduct. And this document outlines beliefs, what a Sikh should believe in, as well as daily practices such as prayers and other ethical guidelines. The current document was essentially finalized in 1945 by the SGPC through a process of consulting with community members, academics and scholars and so on. And it's been amended very slightly since then. What is interesting is that actually this is not a modern phenomenon. Some scholars have thought of the definition of the Sikhs as taking place in the colonial period, but actually this has a long history, and such documents, these kind of codes of conduct, were initially conceived and formulated in the time of Guru Gobind Singh himself. Indeed, you can find guidance on ethics and the boundaries of the Sikh community in the writings of the earlier gurus and of Bhai Gurdas. So going back to the 16th and 17th centuries, one can already find ethical guidelines that then are the basis for modern codes of conduct. Just looking at this process, one can see a couple of motives at work. One is, of course, trying to define common ground. What is the set of beliefs that and practices that can be considered to be something that all Sikhs can and should follow. And mixed in that is ideological motives, where there's some more normative approach. So common ground would be the need to have a practical definition of membership in the community, and ideological being more normative. So again, these two are not completely separable, and again, one can see this as an evolution or process right from the time of Guru Nanak to the modern period. Of course, in the modern period, you have the pressures of a modern legal system and political system, which create other needs to make definitions of who is a Sikh and so on. A little bit about religious life. So I think as we've already said, the Gurdwara is the centerpiece of religious life, and the Guru Granth Sahib is, of course, the centerpiece of the Gurdwara. Congregational worship is the norm. It's very significant. And the other, I think, aspect of the Gurdwara is seva, selfless service. And we talked about examples of that in earlier lectures, such as cleaning the shoes of visitors and serving in the langar to feed any visitors. There are various life passage occasions. There are ceremonies for birth, naming, Charni Lagna, which is introducing a young Sikh to the Guru Granth Sahib, Dastar Bandi, which is tying a turban for the first time on a young Sikh, and then, of course, marriage, the initiation ceremony into the Khalsa, basically a version of the ceremony introduced by Guru Gobind Singh in 1699, and then, of course, ceremonies on the death of a Sikh. Religious life is also marked by historic occasions, and again, these are very important. I've said again and again how important history is to the Sikh community, and it's been a very eventful history. The Guru's birthdays are marked. Martyrdom days, for example, of Guru Arjan and Guru Tegh Bahadur are observed. The day of the founding of the Khalsa on Vaisakhi, the first day of Vaisakh in the Indian calendar, is a very important festival. There are also a couple of occasions which are Sikh variants on more traditional Hindu or South Asian festivals. Bandi Chhod Divas is a Sikh occasion which coincides with Diwali. Some Sikhs would still celebrate it as Diwali, but Bandi Chhod Divas refers to event from the life of Guru Hargobind, where he was imprisoned by the Emperor Jahangir. And when he was offered his freedom, he said he would only take it if other imprisoned local rulers were released with him. And Bandi Chhod refers to that release of the other prisoners. Divas is day. And then Hola Mahalla is a day that corresponds to the traditional South Asian or Hindu festival of Holi, which has its origins in Hindu mythology and is celebrated by Hindus with throwing of colored water or dabbing colored powder on each other. For Sikhs, it's actually celebrated, Hola Mahalla is celebrated with, again, marking events in Sikh history and displays of martial arts. And then finally, there are traditional occasions which are much more South Asian or North Indian or Hindu in nature, which mark harvests, the phases of the moon, or other markers in the calendar. Now, I'd like to now talk about diversity within the mainstream. So there may be 20 to 25 million Sikhs globally. So when I say mainstream, that is defined both in terms of numbers, the majority of that population, and also by what is mostly recognized as the central authority, which, again, most Sikhs would trace back to the authority of the Gurus as embodied in the Guru Granth Sahib, but then again with this complication also embodied in the collective voice of the Khalsa, the Guru Panth. So the Khalsa are known also as Amritdhari. Amrit is nectar, and Dhari means attached to that nectar. So this is Sikhs who have taken gone through the initiation ceremony for the Khalsa that was created by Guru Gobind Singh. And they represent actually a minority of Sikhs. A majority of Sikhs are what one would call Keshdhari, and they are Sikhs who have not gone through the, well, one could include Amritdhari in this. So Keshdhari would be Sikhs who may not have gone through the Amrit ceremony, but they more or less maintain long hair. And again, there can be variations in the degree of observance, but this is in fact then what one would call the mainstream Sikh look, where Sikhs have males in particular have hair, long hair, facial hair, and turbans, and Sikh women in this context would also have long hair, and sometimes also they would wear turbans. Another category is Sajdhari, and this term actually goes back to the time of Guru Gobind Singh, where some Sikhs viewed his introduction of the Khalsa as being too radical in terms of doing away with caste distinctions and caste hierarchies. And Sajdhari literally translates as slow adopters. And it became a term for Sikhs who were sort of reluctant to adopt the Khalsa code of conduct and discipline. In this context, I would also include another term, Nanakpanthi, which is used by some groups that are not that have never actually adhered to the teachings of Guru Gobind Singh. And before Guru Gobind Singh, this was also used as a general term for Sikhs. But since Guru Gobind Singh, it is used much more for some Sikhs who are just followers of the teachings of Nanak and the Guru Granth Sahib, but not the Khalsa ideal of Guru Gobind Singh. Some of these so-called Sindhis, some of these Sikhs are actually so-called Sindhi Sikhs because they live or used to live in the province of Sindh, which is now in Pakistan. So Nanakpanthi and Sajdari both get used in many different ways. I'm using it more in the historical context. And from that perspective, if you use it in the proper historical context, I think it's fair to say that the Sajdari identity has receded as mainstream Sikh identity, with Keshdhari Sikhs being the most significant aspect of Sikh identity. On the other hand, there are other mainstream Sikhs who do not keep long hair. Some of them may have grown up in families which were Keshdhari, but for various reasons they are no longer observant in that respect. Sometimes Sajdari is used for those Sikhs, but that is somewhat misleading in terms of the historical usage of Sajdari. Sometimes Sikhs use other terms for these Sikhs who no longer keep long hair. And on the other hand, those Sikhs view those terms as pejorative. So this is an area in terms of just naming that is still somewhat contentious for Sikhs on both sides of the Keshdhari, non-Keshdhari divide. So perhaps that other mainstream Sikhs, one could just say, define it as non-Keshdhari. There are a couple of other aspects of diversity which I want to highlight. In a previous lecture, I played for you a clip of the Akhand Kirtani Jatha, which is a particular style of kirtan and collective worship. But this group also has its own practices with respect to the Amrit ceremony and what it means to be a member of the Khalsa. And this is actually the Akhand Kirtani Jatha is a 20th century phenomenon, relatively modern, but it's become very popular and influential among Sikhs. So this would be then a subset of the Amritdhari. Then there's another category which is much more amorphous. There's a tradition in North India of sants who are religious leaders. And some scholars have argued that there was a sant tradition in North India in the 16th century, and they viewed that as a subset of the bhakti tradition. I've actually looked at the evidence, and I think this is a misnomer. Sant, when it's used in contemporary writings of the Sikh Gurus, is used in a very generic way for holy people, and when they're talking about the bhakts, they use the term bhagat. So I think that there's some revisionist scholarship required here. But aside from that, so the point there is that this so-called sant tradition is a modern creation. It emerges as a label in the early 20th century. But aside from that, there's this other generic use of sant for religious leader. And what you observe in Punjab and also to some extent in Great Britain and other diaspora locations is the emergence of these sort of decentralized religious leaders with their own personal followings. Some mainstream Sikhs view this as going against the teachings of the Gurus, where the Guru Granth Sahib is the final authority, and sants are seen as usurping that authority. Some of these sants are in fact viewed as, and there is evidence that they are less than savory characters. On the other hand, some of them are actually very, very upright and ethical. A dera is kind of a commune or a location for where the sant has his headquarters. So there's some perhaps loose analogy between this phenomenon of sants and deras and some of the evangelical Christian leaders in the United States, very decentralized, relying on personal charisma and so on. So now I'll turn to other sects, and there's again issues of nomenclature. I've made a distinction between mainstream and non-mainstream. Some would argue that Namdharis, Nirankaris, and the 3HO are all Sikhs. And the 3HO in particular, that stands for Happy, Healthy, Holy, is an organization that was founded by an immigrant from India to the US, Harbhajan Singh, known among his followers as Yogi Bhajan. He started teaching yoga to Westerners, European Americans, in the 1960s. And then many of them converted to the Sikh faith. So they observe the entire Khalsa discipline in terms of the 5Ks. They also, the men and women wear turbans. They also all wear all white. And you saw a couple of examples in those Kirtan clips of Sanatam Kaur and Niranjan Kaur. So in many respects, they are, Sikhs who would fit into the category mainstream. I think what some Sikhs, mainstream Sikhs, find problematic is their treatment of Yogi Bhajan as somebody who is exalted in a way that many mainstream Sikhs find discomforting. The Namdharis, again, you saw Kirtan example of Namdhari Sikhs, and they are a sect that emerges in the early 19th century. Again, I've excluded them from the mainstream because they follow a living guru. They believe that Guru Gobind Singh lived longer than what seems to be the historical evidence, and that then he passed on the guruship to somebody else. So from that perspective, even though, again, they are very strong adherents to the Khalsa tradition, their belief in a living guru sets them slightly apart. And the Nirankaris have, again, somewhat of a similar relationship to mainstream Sikhism. Here they actually are not very strong adherents to the Khalsa tradition. And again, they rely much more on the teachings of the Guru Granth Sahib, distinct from what became practices instituted by Guru Gobind Singh. Then there are communities which are even further from the Sikh mainstream. So Namdharis, Nirankaris, the 3HO, I think it would be very easy to classify them as Sikh sects. The following four groups, I think most Sikhs would not classify them as Sikhs. And it's interesting, I think there's again, some divergence here. If you look at, for example, the Wikipedia article on Sikh sects, it includes Radha Swamis as a sect of the Sikhs. This, I think, is a misunderstanding of Sikh history and also the emergence of the Radha Swamis. The Radha Swamis actually emerge in the 19th century. Their founder is a Hindu who incorporates some Sikh teachings. And I think in the 20th century, a Sikh, a turban bearded Sikh, takes over as leader of at least one group of Radha Swamis. And so that creates more of a connection. But really, they are not I think, part of the Sikh community. Ravidasyas and Valmikis. Ravidasyas are followers of Ravidas, whose writings are included in the Guru Granth Sahib. He was an untouchable from a leather worker caste, which is considered to be quite unclean. But again, the Sikh gurus emphasized equality, social and spiritual equality, by including verses by these bhagats. Ravidasyas are then members of communities that were formerly classified as untouchables or outcasts. There's some parallels or connections between Ravidasyas and Mazhabi Sikhs. What has happened is that some of these groups that have found Sikh practices to be falling short of ideals of equality, and they've broken off, particularly in rural Punjab and to some extent in the United Kingdom, in diaspora communities. Valmiki was actually the legendary writer of the Hindu epic, the Ramayana, and again he was reputedly from a Valmiki, from a untouchable background. So again, these are groups that are not really Sikhs, and they have some overlap with Sikhs, and sometimes their followers are former Sikhs. The Sant Nirankaris are a variant of the Nirankaris, which actually are very divergent from Sikh tradition again. So again, these are fine scholarly distinctions, but I think the classification I've given you is something that most practicing Sikhs would find reasonable. Diversity also has a history. Again, I've talked about the Sikh community as a unified group, but there is a history of dissent and schisms and so on. The first actually occurring after Guru Nanak appointed Angad as his successor, and Guru Nanak's oldest son, Sri Chand, became an ascetic and founded the Udasi order, which continued in various forms to the modern day. You can still find Udasis. I think the historical thread is very tenuous, though, and the use of the term Udasi has been quite elastic. So, for example, the functionaries that I've talked about who Sikhs subjected to controlling the gurdwaras, they styled themselves as Udasis, but they were polygamous, they accumulated wealth, they had guns and used them on Sikhs. This was all completely the opposite of the Udasi order founded by Sri Chand. So I think Udasi in a modern context really has nothing to do with Sikhs, and the term itself is problematic as it's applied by some scholars. The Mervans are named after the nephew of Guru Arjan, the son of Guru Arjan's older brother Prithi Chand, who when Guru Arjan was executed, set himself up as the Guru, and this was basically a rival seat of authority, and in fact Prithi Chand and Mirvan controlled the sacred site of Amritsar, but their influence for various reasons waned, and Sikhs basically voted with their feet for Guru Hargobind and his successors. Similarly, Dhirmal and Ram Rai were from the families of later gurus, and they also set themselves up as spiritual leaders, but were rejected by mainstream Sikhs. In fact, Guru Gobind Singh explicitly issued an injunction for Sikhs to reject Dhirmalyas and Ramrayas. And in the 18th century, these groups basically made their peace and were reabsorbed into mainstream Sikhism. Just one small point, the Mirvans here, many Sikhs call them Minas. This term comes from Bhai Gurdas, and again, it's a derogatory term meaning scoundrels, because Bhai Gurdas was defending what he saw as the true line of gurus as embodied in Guru Hargobind. There's a couple of other groups which are, I think, also of interest. The Nirmalas, which are a small group of Sikhs that claim to be descended from Sikhs who were sent by Guru Gobind Singh to study the Vedas in the Hindu holy city of Varanasi or Benares. Again, the historical evidence for this is tenuous, and given the writings of the Sikh gurus with respect to the authority of the Vedas, my own perspective is that the Nirmalas are not really representative of mainstream Sikh thinking. Nevertheless, they do have an influence. You will find Sikhs who are very attracted to the kind of Veda-based teachings or interpretations of the Sikh sacred texts that are provided by the Nirmalas. Finally, there's the so-called Sanatan Sikhs. Again, some scholars have described conservative Sikhs in the Singh Sabha movement as Sanatan Sikhs, and they style themselves as that, Sanatan being ancient or true. But I think the historical evidence suggests that this was, again, a made-up category trying to claim authenticity for something that wasn't really well established. So again, there's I think before the late 19th century, there's really no evidence of Sanatan Sikhs as a well-defined category. So again, these are contested issues among scholars, but I think the description I'm providing you with is something that most mainstream Sikhs would find acceptable and reasonable. I'll say a little bit now about religious education. The Guru Granth Sahib itself has strong positive statements to say about study and learning, but in the religious context also emphasizes the limits of learning in terms of connection with the divine. So basically saying that empty scholarship, memorizing of verses from religious texts, for example, would be useless. But aside from that, there's a kind of cultural value placed on education, as one would find in many communities. Nothing peculiarly Sikh there, perhaps. But in the context of the evolution of modern society, what one has seen is attempts by the Sikh community to make sure that their community is well represented in the educational ecosystem. So, for example, this goes back in particular to the time of the British, where, again, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs are all trying to revive their communities in the face of what they saw as defeat by the colonial power, and trying to rescue past glory. So you have various categories of religious education. There are religious schools, and these began to be founded by the Singh Sabha in the late 19th, early 20th century, including a strong emphasis on education for girls, again in keeping with the Sikh tradition, but also what was seen as adopting more modern approaches to social organization. So these were often called Khalsa schools for both for girls and for boys, and Khalsa colleges were also founded at this time. The examples I've given here are more modern examples. The Guru Harkrishan Public School in the Indian capital of Delhi was started precisely to offer an option of religious education in the context of the broader Indian educational system, post-independence educational system, to prepare students for college, but also give them a religious education. And in this context, public here is the British usage of public, meaning basically a fee-paying or private school. The other example, the Akal Academy, also known as Badu Sahib, is located in the foothills of the Himalayas in Himachal Pradesh. And this also is a development of a colonial tradition which created British-style boarding schools in cooler places where the British and wealthy Indians could send their children. Again, this is a boarding school which has a very heavy emphasis on religious education as well as academic preparation. There's also a network of missionary colleges and seminaries which are funded by the SGPC or sometimes by sants. And one example of these is the Damdami Taksal. And for example, Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, who was a very significant figure in what happened in before and after 1984. Before 1984, of course, as a living person and militant, and after that as a symbol. But he was educated in this Taksal. And then you also have the Nirmalas, as I mentioned earlier, and they they have a tradition of religious education, which, as I said, is very heavily influenced by Vedic interpretations. Earlier, I'd introduced the term sant, which is often used for somebody who is a religious leader, and they may or may not have a formal religious education, but one way or the other, they've developed some skill in say, preaching and making connections, religious connections for their followers. A different term is gyani, which is actually a formal designation. Gyani comes from gyan or knowledge, and this is a designation given to a graduate of specific missionary colleges that are approved by the Sikh authorities. So turning to the geographic and decentralized aspect of Sikh authority, the SGPC in Punjab and in other parts of India, in some cases there are slightly separate organizations. The SGPC has a membership which is based on qualification, and that's where issues of who is a Sikh come into play. What degree of observance of Sikh practices is necessary or desired there, and then you have the committee itself, which is elected, and so the membership, the broader membership, is the voting body for electing the members of the committee, and the committee then have power over decisions that affect the gurdwaras and use of money and so on. So there's very complicated issues of politics that enter there. There are also local gurdwaras, and they are not directly under the authority of the SGPC. Each local gurdwara will have a management committee, and of course local laws and regulations will apply. So gurdwara in a neighborhood in the city of Delhi would have its own regulations, which would follow the local regulations within India and also the city of Delhi. In the United States, of course, you have the 501c3 code for nonprofits and the religious code as well for religious organizations. And so basically one has, just like other religious organizations, an adaptation to the local legal and regulatory systems. There are also attempts to create federated organizations given the spread of Sikhs around the world. For example, there are a couple of diaspora organizations, the World Sikh Council and the Global Sikh Council. There are various rival organizations, and there's some decentralization within these organizations. So, for example, there are regional structures. The WSC America region is meant to serve as an umbrella body for all the gurdwaras in the United States, and the idea is that they would then provide guidance and guidelines for local Gurdwara management committees. Ultimately, of course, the central authorities, the SGPC, and even the Akal Takht will try to determine what is appropriate conduct. So, for example, Sikhs in langar will sit on the floor, observing a tradition that goes back, of course, to the 16th century. But that is something that the Akal Takht has said is something that Sikhs should observe, rather than sitting on chairs at tables when having langar. Turning to political parties, so here now one is moving away from religious institutions to institutions of modern Indian democracy. The main Sikh political party is the Akali Dal, or I guess its full name is Shiromani Akali Dal. Shiromani, again, is respected, the same word you find in SGPC. And this is actually descended from the mass movement of the 1920s, which took over from the Singh Sabha movement and effected the rescuing of the Gurdwaras from the corrupt functionaries. So this has been viewed as a Sikh political party. Its membership has been mostly Sikhs, though in recent years they've tried to make it more broad-based, and they've also actually created political alliances, interestingly, with the Bharatiya Janata Party, the Hindu Nationalist Party that now governs India. The membership base for the Akali Dal has been mostly from rural areas, from farmers, and again, there's also some overlap with the caste category of Jats. So Akali Dal leaders have often been Jat Sikhs. There are also many splinter versions of the Akali Dal, and those are named after various different factions, different people who lead those factions. But there's really right now only one mainstream Akali Dal party. The SGPC I've talked about earlier as a religious institution, but to some extent, because of its control over Sikh historic shrines and its control over revenue flows, has been strongly subject to political influence. And so, for example, leaders of the Akali Dal have tried to place their confidants or cohorts in leadership positions in the SGPC. So that's been a struggle for Sikhs to deal with that intermingling of religion and politics, which again has a long tradition in Sikh history, but in the context of a modern democracy can be sometimes problematic. Then another political party is the Indian National Congress, which was originally an umbrella movement for the freedom movement in India. Jawaharlal Nehru, Mohandas Gandhi were members of the Indian National Congress. This was the party that ruled India after independence and for many decades. There were other smaller parties that were opposition parties. There were splits from the Indian National Congress. And currently, actually, the Congress is been reduced to, at the national level, has been reduced to a very small presence in the parliament, maybe just 10% of the seats in the lower house of the Indian parliament are held by the Congress. So they're in somewhat of disarray. But the government before the BJP was a Congress government from 2004 to 2014. And as I may have mentioned earlier, the Prime Minister in that government, Manmohan Singh, is a Sikh, and he's still an active member of the Congress party. The Congress party has historically attracted some Sikhs, as particularly in recent years, Sikhs, urban Sikhs and non-Jats, but again, that's very mixed, and The Congress is not a Sikh party. It's very much a party that attracts support from different religious groups and so on. And as of 2020, this is the party that rules the state of Punjab. So the state legislature is under the control of the Congress. There are also many radical groups, which one can classify as religious or political groups. And there are also other non-religious parties that are present in Punjab. At one stage, the Aam Aadmi Party, which is a new urban, relatively middle-class party, which now rules Delhi, was making some headway in Punjab, but that seems to have fallen away for now. So here are some examples of just illustrations of what I've been talking about earlier. You can see the symbols of the Shiromani Akali Dal, the scales, and the Congress Party, the hand. Symbols are very important in Indian elections because when many voters are illiterate, they use the symbol to decide where to put their marks on the ballot paper. And to the right of the Akali Dal symbol is Prakash Singh Badal, who was the last Akali chief minister of Punjab. And I think it's fair to mention that his regime was viewed as extremely corrupt. Amrinder Singh is now the chief minister of Punjab. He's next to the hand symbol of the Congress. And he has served in the army. He's actually a descendant of the Maharaja Patiala, and it remains to be seen how his current administration will do in terms of governing Punjab. And I say that because the state of Punjab faces very severe political and economic challenges. In the 1960s, what came to be known as the Green Revolution was introduced. It involved using high-yielding varieties combined with irrigation and fertilizers to grow wheat and then later rice, new varieties of wheat and rice. So this increased yields dramatically, and Punjab and the neighboring state of Haryana became the main sources of food supply to the public distribution system, which provided subsidized food grains to the entire country. So this brought prosperity to Punjab in the 60s and maybe through the 70s, but that has been followed by a period of diminishing returns, where yields are no longer increasing. In some cases, especially with environmental degradation, yields are actually static. And what we're seeing is basically a depletion of the water table because surface water is not enough. Farmers are pumping water from tube wells. They receive subsidized power to do that, so subsidized electric power. So basically there's a very accelerated environmental degradation going on. Also misuse of fertilizers and runoff from that is also polluting the water. The Green Revolution has also seen increased inequality, where some farmers have been able to consolidate land holdings through leasing in and are doing very well. And that is also a cause of concern. There's also a perceived erosion of values or morality. This, in fact, goes back to some of the concerns of Bhindranwale back in the 1970s that was associated with the modernization of the economy. There's also evidence of increased alcohol and drug abuse. There's not been a development of alternatives to agriculture as mechanization has freed up labor. There's been use of migrant labor from poorer Indian states like Bihar, but what one sees is really a very unstable social situation in Punjab. I think it's compounded by the fact that Punjab is also on the border with Pakistan and Afghanistan have both been very unstable politically for reasons connected to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. response, 9/11. All of that has had a big, and also actually Chinese attempts to have an influence in the region. So all of those have really spilled over into Punjab. As I mentioned, there's been a great deal of political corruption in Punjab, and some of that is just plain explicit political corruption, but there's also vested interests which act as political economy barriers to change, making it difficult to get out of this now degraded so-called Green Revolution. And finally, I think one of Punjab's challenges is that it's a small state with a majority-minority population within the much larger country of India. And so it has become quite marginalized within the larger Indian polities. So because India is federalized, it's a federal system, but very centralized, there are severe limits on what the state government can do. And I think that is also a big challenge. And all of this matters because Sikhs are the majority of the population of Punjab, and the vast majority of Sikhs worldwide live in Punjab. So the challenges of Punjab, I think, are also challenges for the Sikh community.